So the goal of today's episode is to give our corporate immigration and global mobility listeners a better understanding of what a Harris administration or a potential Trump administration would look like in their corporate immigration programs. So we're not going to be doing so much predicting, more like forecasting based on what we know today and translating that into what it would mean for high-level program strategy and impacting the day-to-day work of global mobility teams. And there's no one better to help us break this down than Cecilia Esterline. Cecilia, thanks for joining us today. Can you jump right in and introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, where you work, and what you do.
Sure. Thank you so much, Laura, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be able to join you today. So I work at the Niskanen Center, which is a think tank here in DC. We work on a number of different issue areas with a pretty unique policy perspective, really trying to focus on practical solutions that can build consensus across the political spectrum. So I personally work on immigration policy, primarily focusing on employment-based immigration.
Fantastic. And Cecilia, you yourself were once a business immigration paralegal during the 2018-2019 Hire American, Buyer American Trump policies. And so you worked through some of those administration policies, but also then are reviewing the Biden-Harris policies. So seen a lot of change. Can you tell us about the sort of background between the change in administrations and, if Trump or Harris were to be elected, what kind of impact their platforms might have on corporate immigration programs?
Sure. So yeah, as you said, I have been really lucky to see this issue kind of from the inside out for the past several years. And so I think that we're in an interesting time right now. Immigration has really dominated the public discourse in the course of the election season. But at the same time, employment-based immigration, the issue area that you and I work on all the time, it's kind of been hidden from the spotlight. So what we know is in some ways limited. And I would say that's even more so true for Vice President Harris's campaign. I think that we're going to get into it a little bit more later. But, on the Harris side, the Democratic Party, they had floated a draft platform about a month ago, maybe. But that was before Biden had even dropped out. And so it's really not clear if any of that is going to change with the upcoming convention this weekend. And then I think on her side, we have indications from her past that we might be talking about a little bit later, any comments that she's made publicly. And I think on the Trump side, he's had a bit more time to develop his portfolio and develop his sense of where, we can guess that he is on that issue. We could look at Project 2025, his comments and interviews and rallies, comments of his campaign, and of course, on the adopted Republican platform that they adopted at the convention last month. So I think there's a lot that we're going to get into, and so eager to help start that out.
Yeah, and for months and months, it looked like this race was going to be a runaway victory for Trump in a contest against Biden. But I've been talking with my global mobility clients and contacts about Project 2025, and in fact, used your article and your research to help guide them into what Project 2025 would look like if and when implemented, with the changes in the DOL, wage leveling, specifically removing wage 1 and 2, and what that would look like for future H-1B sponsorship. So thanks for that research. But the question here is, I know I've been speculating on a potential Trump policy is tricky, but based on your analysis of his past policies and the policies of the people he puts into positions of power, what do you think a Trump agenda for employment-based immigration looks like in 2025, 2026?
Yeah, so I will first say that, although former President Trump has really tried to distance himself from Project 2025 recently, I think that on the topic of immigration and legal immigration even more so, I can't really talk to the other issue areas, but I think that it's still one of, if not the best tool we have for evaluating what is likely to be seen if he wins a second term. And I think that that's in part because it gets into a lot more detail and a lot more substance than anything he might be saying publicly can. And we've already seen where his words and what he says publicly doesn't always align with the party and the campaign really intends to do. So, for instance, we saw him say back in June that he planned to give a green card to every graduate of a U.S. university. And it wasn't But hours later, when the campaign said, no, he didn't mean it that way, they wanted something with aggressive vetting, and that's their term, aggressive vetting, and they wanted to exclude a number of other groups of individuals based on really politically charged criteria. And that would only go to what they referred to as the most worthy individuals who were going to make the biggest and most significant impact and biggest contribution to the US. And so that's a long way off from just giving a green card to every US graduate. So I think that that really signals to us that what he says is not always reflective of the policies that would be implemented if he were able to win a second term, because there are people that know the policies and their depth and in their expertise is in that policy. And those are the ones who are going to be put in power. And I think that a lot of those people are authors of Project 2025, or if not, they're ones who are prominent writers around that area. So I think that it's important to, yes, of course, listen to what he's saying, but also look at the other people who would likely be implementing the policies that he is at the forefront of when it comes time to have someone with expertise. So in that sense, I think that we are likely to see, under a second Trump administration, big changes at USCIS. We know already from his first administration that denials of H-1Bs and L-1s really, increased significantly under the first administration. And I think it is reasonable to expect that we will see more of the same with that. Even with the straightforward applications of petitions, I think we'll see that they're being subject to additional scrutiny. And if we look at Project 2025 as an indication of something, and even if half of those immigration policies are implemented on the legal immigration side, I think we would see denial numbers rise even more. But more so, I think that processing times at USCIS are really likely to skyrocket. The policy suggests that creating, backlogs and changing parts of our system to really create delays that would be very, difficult for businesses that really need to submit timely filings and need to be able to obtain status regularly. I also think one other area that we can kind of extrapolate from some of the public comments, it's not necessarily just what Project 2025 says, but in general, public comments that he's made in interviews and also what we see with Project 2025, I think we'll see kind of a scaling back of any kind of program that really is based purely on administrative authority. And while a lot of those are humanitarian programs, I think that one that might affect the listeners of this podcast are, the international entrepreneur role for anyone who's hiring someone for a startup. I think that that is something that we're likely to see either cut off completely or severely restricted. And even beyond USCIS, I think that other things that are also under executive purview could also be subject to additional changes. Things like the pilot programs for domestic renewal or the consular processing interview waivers. I think things like that really affected our ability to continue processing applications and petitions regularly and getting people in that businesses really needed. I think those are things that, regardless of whether or not everything comes true in Project 2025 or not, I think that those are things that we can really reasonably expect to see as priorities for a second Trump administration, in addition to things like nationality restrictions, similar to the travel ban utilized in the first administration, and measures of that nature, really focusing on things that can be done administratively, even short of everything that is described in Project 2025.
Wow, that was an excellent summary. And I think just to high level bullet it, I think, our listeners, corporate immigration, mobility professionals listening, should be thinking about budgeting for additional RFEs, like Cecilia said, and budgeting time for lengthy adjudication processes. So whether that's preparing extensions, even earlier, submitting them exactly on that 6-month mark, because with some of the changes proposed in Project 2025, it just removes a lot of resources for USCIS. And we know right now, USCIS is not turning around adjudications quickly. Any catch-up the Biden administration was able to make in the post-pandemic era will be lost. And that, processing abroad would get even slower or altogether restricted based on nationalities. So things will get more expensive and more lengthy in adjudication, whether in the US or outside the US. So stay tuned. That could be another rough season. On the other side of the race, Kamala Harris in the last couple of weeks has sort of infamously denounced many of the positions she held when she was initially running for president back in 2020. Now, that's a lot more on the border crisis and illegal immigration. But, can you speak to candidate Harris's perspective on an agenda for employment-based immigration policy? We have some readings of her time in the Senate, but what can you tell us about anything she said today and her history on these issues?
Yeah. So I think that, this is a bit of speculation because Vice President Harris could choose to distinguish herself and kind of forge her own path away from that what we've seen under President Biden, or she could choose to kind of continue his legacy. And what I would say is that right now, thus far, we've seen a bit of both on the campaign trail. She's been really careful to highlight the wins that they've had while trying to demonstrate the plans for her administration. Again, though, as expected, employment-based immigration is not at the forefront of the campaign's rhetoric around immigration. And when I mentioned earlier the original draft of the Democratic Party's platform that we're not sure is going to be changed or not, it only includes a single line mention of expanding legal immigration. And the rest of it just focuses on the border security, asylum reforms, and family reunification. It doesn't really mention what it means to actually expand legal immigration and what do they mean for that, though. And so I guess first, I would say most recently during her tenure as vice president, yes, she's been mostly focused on this root causes idea and this idea of border security and stabilizing Central America. But she has also regularly commented on expanded legal pathways as a necessary part of border reform. And part of that might be a humanitarian solution. But, my own research and researchers other in the field have also shown relationships between illegal border crossings and H-2 visas in particular. So I do think it's possible that we might see at least a continuation of the supplemental H-2B allocations that we've seen over the past few years if Harris were to obtain an administration. I think that in terms of her record in the Senate, that can also be leveraged in a sense to give us an idea of at least what issues she, cares about enough to co-sponsor a bill. A lot of it is about border regularization of certain populations, DACA recipient protections, and other humanitarian measures. But there are some indicators of where she stands on employment. So in 2019, she did introduce the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigration Act, which would have removed the country cap from employment-based immigration categories. And so it would have allocated not any additional visas to help the backlog, but just, make it a first come, first serve process rather than one that differentiates based on nationality. She also co-sponsored the Keep STEM Talent Act of 2019, which would have exempted certain STEM graduates from annual green card limits if they met certain requirements. And she's spoken previously also about the necessity during COVID, especially the necessity and the important role that immigrant international students play in the United States. So also one of the other regularization measures that I mentioned that she helped introduce in the Senate was the agricultural worker program that would have helped to regularize some agricultural workers. And so, I think that these things are not necessarily exactly indicative of what she would do if she were to obtain the presidency, but I think it kind of points to what her priorities are. She does have some, interest in maintaining STEM talent. She has some interest in, changes to the employment-based visa categories. And so I think that in terms of permanent visas, so I think that these are kind of indicators maybe of something that she has an interest in and something that it would be possible to pursue under a Harris administration. I guess there's two other things I would mention that while she was in the Senate, she also co-sponsored the Agricultural Worker Program Act, which would have created kind of a regularization program specifically for agricultural workers. So I think that might point to some interest in, reforms or changes to the H-2 program that could be beneficial for those populations. And also when she was district attorney, she did have some cases of when she was going after employers who had underpaid or otherwise violated workers' rights of migrant workers. And so how that translates to whether or not she would have the same level of scrutiny or pursuit over employers utilizing legal visa programs, I think that's really yet to be seen, whether or not that translates to a national level. And that was quite a while ago in terms of years. So I'm not sure if that's still consistent with where she is now. But I guess in summary, I would say that in contrast to a potential Trump administration, I think that a potential Harris administration would be much less focused on slowing down USCIS and would be more focused on maintaining and regularizing the immigration pathways as they are. I think what's yet to be seen is if her focus on asylum and humanitarian policies creates a backlogs or impacts in any way the immigration processing times of our legal and employment-based categories, as we do see some impact right now from USCIS being burdened with, high levels in the asylum categories that don't receive the fee funding that other categories do. But I do think we're still yet to see if she will create a more concrete platform that differentiates herself from Biden. I think we'll see in the coming months where she stands on this and hopefully if she's going to come out and speak about it. But I do expect that at least international student retention and some priorities of this in that area will be at least part of her platform when it comes time to it.
Huge. Yeah. It sounds like, with a Harris administration, we probably would see the same levels or increased levels of compliance, like in the fraud detection, especially around the H-1B. I know that's something we're seeing an uptick with in the Biden administration, more I-9 investigations. We probably, given your analysis and what we've seen from a district attorney, Harris, that she's aware of these issues and that could be a focus in balance with potential caps or numbers, but that would have to come through Congress if we were going to see any relief for the number of visas available for employment-based green cards or increasing H-1B numbers. Like, she's probably aware of these issues, and any increase or inflexibility for the H-1B programs or visa programs probably comes with increased scrutiny of compliance or potential fees.
Definitely.
For our corporate immigration and global mobility listeners on the other side, it would be budgeting for compliance efforts, budgeting for a potential good news of moving forward with adjustment of status filings. Of course, that would probably have a long pipeline because that would have to go through Congress. So we would have a lot of notice period to see where that was going, but always good to be checking in with your immigration lawyers to know where your program stands, what that would look like, who could benefit from any of these potential relief movements from a Harris administration. Let's talk a little bit more about the bottom of the ticket and some of the other people around each candidate that could impact their agendas of employment-based immigration. You mentioned a little bit about Project 2025 with the authors surrounding the potential new Trump administration and how they would be in place. But what about J.D. Vance? Does he have anything on the record for employment-based immigration, or potential VP Waltz? Does he have anything out there that would allow us to forecast what the VP candidates would or would not do around the employment-based immigration issues?
Yeah, so as expected, their records are much shorter and much more narrow on this. J.D. Vance has only been in the Senate for a year, I think. And so he's had a really short tenure there. And most of his record on immigration since he was elected has been really focused on border enforcement. He did, however, co-sponsor the Higher Wages for Americans Workers Act of 2023 that raised the American minimum wage, but it also mandated E-Verify usage across the board. And so I think that, that's something that's definitely of interest to him. He did co-sponsor also the Immigration Parole Reform Act of 2023, which would have, again, focused on this presidential parole authority and on limiting it further. And again, while this is likely mostly targeting the humanitarian programs, it could also affect programs like the International Entrepreneur Role. However, I will say that since he has joined the campaign trail, he has mentioned wanting U.S. immigration to be based on merit. And so how that would play out if he is to become vice president is really yet to be seen. I think that obviously overhauling our entire immigration system would require a lot of congressional action. And so as you said, there will be a lot of notice and plenty of time for it to change and evolve along the way. But I will say that having that interest in mind, he might have, increased interest in vetting and changing procedures at USCIS, things like deference that might be affected by something like this that is really focused on prioritizing merit as the number one motivator for deciding who comes to this country and who does not. So on the Tim Walz side, I would say that, as a governor, the immigration roles are a bit limited. But, he did some things. He, issued licenses to the undocumented. He supported the bipartisan border bill. But one thing that I think we can mention is that he, as governor, was criticizing the wait times for asylum applications. Now, perhaps some of that is focused on the courts, but if he has in mind that there's this backlog also happening at USCIS, it might point to an interest of, improving processing times and improving efficiency, things that we have seen for years that, USCIS needs to modernize its procedures and make sure that it has the staff and technology necessary to adjudicate petitions rapidly and effectively. Whether or not those things really conflate, I'm not sure yet. We'll have to see. Does that mean he'll support, improved processing measures when it comes to a national scale? That's still yet to be seen. But I do think that it's a good indication that at least he's plugged in, even from the perspective of a governor. He was really plugged in to know that those policies and the wait times were exceeding what was ever supposed to be normal or expected. So I think that at least that points to an interest in and having that discussion and something that he might be responsive to if he were to be elected as vice president.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the merit-based system is always an interesting conversation, and we know other countries that have successfully implemented it, like Canada, our northern neighbor there, and it really does take away discretion from USCIS, which quite frankly is kind of the bedrock of a lot of USCIS adjudication. USCIS has maintained this high level of discretion in which to keep with an administration and policies and prioritization. And so that'll be interesting to see, if that conversation unfolds under their administration, what that might look like. I think a lot of employment-based practitioners like myself would love that because we could give our clients a lot more guarantees, where it is very difficult to do that in a practice today with USCIS holding so much discretion and able to issue RFEs or denials without much justification. Cool. Flipping the conversation to you, is there anything we didn't talk about today that you think corporate immigration and global mobility professionals should know about the election or about any other potential regulatory changes in the pipeline?
I guess it's important to note that on either side of the aisle, there is a real opportunity for conversation in terms of employment-based immigration, because even though immigration is quite politicized, employment-based does, benefit from a certain level of interest on both sides of the aisle. And so I think that regardless of the administration, there are opportunities and things that will be coming down the line, even if it won't be the, headline-making news. It might be something that we are to expect, and there are opportunities, and those of us in the policy world are really thinking through what those policies are. But I think that also coming up to the election and before Inauguration Day, there are still some items pending on the regulatory agenda that are relevant to our area of immigration, and how the administration handles them in the coming months is yet to be seen. One thing is the H-1B rule. I know that you all know that it was partially implemented earlier this year, but there's plenty of it that is still pending. So everything from the specialized occupation definition to beneficiary owners, the deference policies, I think that, either we will see that those things need to be implemented, they need to be scrapped from the plan and then finalized in another one, or perhaps the, Biden administration decides to withdraw it completely before a new administration takes office. And so how they decide to strategically plan that out, whether they decide before the election, afterwards, I think that's yet to be seen. But I do think there is, particularly on the issue of deference, that having the opportunity to kind of codify that in regulation is a big opportunity from the H-1B rule. But if it is not codified, then it could also create a liability with a change of administration, and how an administration, potentially that is against deference, perhaps the Trump administration, how they could respond to that and utilize comments in order to finalize a rule that is far from what the Biden administration originally intended. So whether or not there is a decision to withdraw or whether or not they finalize that in the coming months, I think that's something really to watch for. I think there's also a few other rules that haven't even made it to the notice of proposed rulemaking stage yet. And so it's unclear if we're going to still expect those before the election or before Inauguration Day. But among those that are proposed is one titled Modernizing Regulations Governing Non-Immigrant Workers. And the proposed language is not even out yet, But if the rule does come out, of course, the employment-based immigration community really has to be poised to respond and could very quickly be affected by anything that is pushed through before the end of the election and lame duck period.
Yeah, wow. So we could see some really big swings in the employment-based space even before a change in administration. So that's huge. And, as far as how to advise our listeners, like Cecilia said, that'll be something that we'll have to invite Cecilia back on once more of that language is published, and how the business immigration community will respond will be determined based on what's proposed. So a lot to come, and we're only in August. August 13th is the date of this recording. So we'll see what's yet to come this year. And then finally, Cecilia, is there anything you want to ask me to get a corporate immigration attorney's point of view on any of the administration proposals or what's to come?
I really appreciated the guidance you kind of translate the policy, speak into, and how it's applicable to all your listeners. I guess one thing I would ask is, in 2023, what I perceived as one of the biggest barriers to quote unquote normal functioning of our legal immigration system were the absurd consular processing times. And, those have calmed down a bit in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. And so I guess I'm asking now, what would you say is the biggest impediment to business as usual, or have we returned to so-called business as usual when it comes to employment-based immigration, or what's the biggest barrier right now?
Wow, great question. I do think consular processing has regulated in most countries, but the thing that's popping up that's preventing business as usual is the high levels of administrative processing that we're seeing specifically out of China. And that is likely a policy security measure that we're seeing. We never get a readout into exactly why someone is subject to administrative processing at a U.S. consular abroad, but they're given what's known as like a 221G notice of potential denial here. And so that basically holds that foreign national employee who's gone home for visiting a sick family member, emergency visit to a manufacturing plant abroad, and then is stuck to secure their visa in order to return to the U.S. And we're seeing processing times just delay the return of that employee. And so businesses often have to pivot very quickly. Many businesses and companies that I have don't allow employees to bring company laptops or property outside of the US. And so when they're stuck in this unknown wait time of consular processing, the company really has to consider, are we putting them on a leave of absence? What are they going to do? Because they can't perform productive work while they're outside of the US. And so that's really causing a lot of hiccups because it's really unknown. So effectively, we have to prep our clients with what will happen if this employee gets stuck in administrative processing. That's just from the business side. Of course, there's the personal impacts to that foreign national that's stuck abroad, whether that's separated from their family or not. So there's a lot of stress when sending folks for visa stamping, particularly Chinese-born foreign nationals that are securing visas out of China. So one practical guidance we give clients, if possible, could they visa stamp in another country? That comes with its own risks and expenses, but we, advise on a case-by-case basis. So that's been one that's been popping up a lot recently that is impacting the business as usual, as well as the foreign nationals just living their lives in the U.S.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard of the uptick, so that's really helpful. Thank you.
You're so welcome. And to wrap up here, Cecilia, can you tell listeners where and how to find you and your work?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter or on Niskanen's website. Everything that I publish there is written, and that's Niskanen center.org. Please feel free to follow me on either method, and I'm happy to continue writing and sharing with you all.
Well, we're big fans of you here at WR Immigration and the Business Immigration Benchmark. Thanks for sharing all your expertise with us today, Cecilia.
Thanks so much for having me.